Hello, and thank you for joining our webinar today, which is sponsored by the Access Forum. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome Filippo Natoli, who will present his paper, The Macroeconomic Effects of Temperature Surprise Shocks. Filippo is a senior economist at the Advanced Economies and International Finance Division of the Bank of Italy. His research interests lie at the intersection of macroeconomics and finance, with a focus on monetary and fiscal policies and on the economic implications of climate change. His work has been published in the Journal of International Economics, IMF Economic Review, and International Journal of Central Banking, among others. He holds a PhD in economics from Lewis University in Rome. Today's webinar is the third of our series on modeling frameworks for climate change mitigation policies. The first webinar was on May 23rd, and the speaker was Mike Barnett from Arizona State University, who presented his paper, Climate Change Uncertainty Spillover in the Macroeconomy. It was a paper that he co-authored with Lars Hansen and William Brock. In their model, the policymaker was faced with uncertainty related to carbon and temperature dynamics, and also uncertainty about the curvature of the economic damage function. The optimal policy was then selected by applying the minimax decision rule. The second webinar was on June 6th, and the speaker was Chuck Mansky from Northwestern University, who presented his paper, Minimax Regret Climate Policy, with deep uncertainty in climate modeling and intergenerational discounting. He had co-authored this paper with Stephen DeCanio and Alan Sunstead. In this model, the policymaker was faced with uncertainty related to carbon and temperature dynamics, but unlike the Barnett paper, the policymaker knew the shape of the outcome damage function, of the economic damage function. The optimal policy was selected by applying the minimax regret decision rule. You can find more information as well as the papers and the slides, both of those webinars on our websites. For today's webinar, Filippo's empirical research focuses strictly on short-term temperature shocks and how central banks, and in particular the Fed, reacted to them. But as always, I would like to invite you to answer the short survey that should appear on your screen. So the first question is, climate change is inducing higher and more volatile temperatures, having economic impacts both on the supply and demand side. What do you think is the sign of the overall effects on GDP and consumer prices in the United States? And the second question was, how should monetary policy intervene to counteract the effects of unfavorable temperatures? Okay, so the majority, 71%, thinks the effect on GDP is negative and positive on consumer prices. And for the second question, 46% responded that monetary policy should use other measures to counteract the effects of unfavorable temperatures. Good. So, Filippo, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Anastasia. It's a great pleasure to be here and present in such a great webinar series. So I share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so I work in the research department of Banca d'Italia, and in this paper, I'd like to present my research on the effects of temperatures on the macroeconomy. So let's go ahead. Okay, my presentation will be, will proceed in this way. First, I will motivate my research question, and I explain my main points. Then I will guide you step by step through my shock. And finally, I propose an application based on an impulse response analysis to analyze the effects of temperatures on the US economy. Okay, first of all, with the research question. So climatologists and economists all agree that climate change has adverse economic impacts. The first research in economics has point to the fact that climate change has a negative effect on GDP and the growth rate of output across the world, mainly on emerging economies with higher temperature levels and higher vulnerability to shocks. But in the recent years, there is a new strand of literature that has found that these effects are also exist in advanced economies, and in particular, the United States is no exception. So the academic community now agrees that there is a need for a global policy response that should start with national governments that are able to impose carbon taxes or to impose new regulation to design mechanisms for carbon pricing. So apart from the discussion regarding the design of a climate policy, there is also a discussion regarding the role of central banks, and in particular on what central banks can do to support the fight against climate change. So the central bankers around the world have expressed their opinion and regarding their engagement to do their best within their mandate to contribute to mitigate and avert climate change. For two reasons. The first reason is that the climate shocks, short-term shocks related to climate change may have a detrimental effect on the domestic economy, to which monetary policy may have to respond. And the second point is that in the longer term, climate change may be a threat for the stability of the financial system. In particular, if you look at extreme temperatures, previous contributions have found that extreme temperature may have both supply side effects, for example, a negative effect in labor productivity in temperature exposed working tasks, but also demand side ones. For example, in periods of very hot days, households and firms should spend more money to cool or refresh their workplaces or households or housings, and this can in turn reduce the available space to spend money for other reasons, to make productive consumption or investment. So the question that arises is that how the conduct itself of monetary policy might be affected by extreme temperatures. That is a question that comes before the question of what a central bank can do to help in the fight of climate change. So to answer this question, I mean, to provide a way to answer this question, one needs to define what is a temperature shock. With a definition of shock, it's then possible to analyze their full macroeconomic propagation. So in my paper, I propose a new way to construct these shocks, and these shocks are based on the surprise effect of temperatures. I start from granular data at both at high frequency, I use daily frequency, and from a geographical point of view, I use county level data from the United States, and I use this data to construct quarterly shock series for the entire United States as a whole. I then use this series as a narrative shock in a local projection framework to test the effects on the components of GDP, on consumer prices, and interest rates of public government bonds. To understand a little bit more what is the reaction of monetary policy, I also inspect the response of the short-term forecast made in the Green Book forecast, and I also inspect the reaction of the FOMC looking at meeting transcripts. The preview of the results is that I find that temperature shocks have a significant effect on GDP via both consumption and investment, but I weight more on the latter component. The response of consumer prices appears to be more muted, and also it appears discontinuously throughout my sample of analysis. And this may suggest that demand and supply side effects almost balance out on average. Regarding the response of monetary policy, I might say that it seems that the Federal Reserve do react to the shock from three reasons. The first one is that I see from the impulse response of short-term rates that there is an effect on short-term interest rates. So it seems that the Federal Reserve is cutting interest rates in reaction of a shock, and this effect spread out through the yield curve. There is also a significant revision of Green Book forecast, and also an increase in temperature wording during FOMC meetings after the shock. Let's go to this shock. So the first question is why there is the reason to construct a new type of shock. Usually in the literature of the macro effect of temperatures, the effects are estimated using average temperature levels, or statistics based on extreme temperature, like the number of very hot days occurred in a given time period, like 1 year, for example. As an econometric framework, there are two typical analyses that are carried out with temperature, that is fixed effects panel estimates and time series estimates via VAR and local projections. The identification assumptions that are behind these settings are, for fixed effects panels, that deviation with respect to average temperature levels of actual temperature are considered as exogenous. In a time series framework, the assumption made by identifying VAR and local projection with a Cholesky restriction, that is the typical identification tool used in this literature, is that the short-run variation is exogenous to economic activity. That is true. So this should not be a great problem, because actually the feedback effects from the stock of greenhouse gas concentration to economic activity and temperature to economic activity and temperature is something that takes longer. So this assumption is considered true in the literature. And very importantly is that regarding these two assumptions, there is a third assumption that is implicit in these identification schemes that say that upward and downward variation in average temperatures map precisely with positive and negative economic shocks. So why this assumption is problematic? So, well, because temperatures are not behave not the same as other macroeconomic variables. For example, usual variables that are used to construct policy shocks, for example, government spending variables, have a clear direction that maps with a clear direction of a shock, of the expected effect on the economy. For example, a positive government spending shock should have a positive effect on the economy, while a negative shock should have a negative effect. So this is so in that case, the sign of the shock really tells something about the sign of the effect. For temperatures, is not the same, because it's more the size of the variation than the sign that matters. And this is not my claim, but is something that comes from the literature on climate change that says that the effects of temperatures are highly nonlinear. I'll make two examples. One is related to the early literature on the economics of climate change, at least the empirical part, that is related to agriculture. And this paper by Schlenker and Roberts in 2009 found that while moderately hot temperatures are good for crops because they increase the speed to which plant grows, on the contrary, if temperatures become too hot, actually the effects turns bad. It becomes very bad for crops. So this is one thing. The other evidence is related to the relationship between temperatures and mortality. This is a famous paper by Banca and co-authors in 2016. They find a U-shaped relationship such that extreme temperatures, both hot and cold, have a negative effect, a positive effect on mortality. So they increase mortality, while mild temperatures reduce mortality significantly. So these are just two examples, but this non-linearity of effects of temperature is something that is established in the literature of climate change. So in this perspective, upward versus downward variations of temperature, that is what you can find in usual identification assumption, potentially mixes good and bad economic shocks. So the second point instead is more related to the Painel fixed effects identification scheme, and is based on the fact that climate change is a continuous process that has not only effects on the trend of temperatures, but also on its volatility. If you take into account that climate change continuously affects these two variables, actually it's easy to understand that long-run averages of temperatures cannot be a reference for current shocks. And this is based on another evidence that is common in the literature, so that agents form their expectations about temperatures by learning from past experience. And this is, if you consider that agents form these expectations and based on the expectations adapt their behavior to increasingly volatile temperature, this entails the fact that defining a shock as a deviation of temperature from long-run averages may not be such an exogenous way to define as it needs to define macro shocks. So briefly, what the challenge is to make a shock using temperatures, as I said, related to the direction of the effects. And it's not only something related to seasons, but also to industries, because temperatures can have differentiated effects by sectors. Heat can be good in some seasons and bad in others, and so on. The other challenge is to isolate unexpected component, because for example, a fair number of very hot days in summer are not surprising for anyone. But what is surprising is something that comes in excess of this, and I will show you in a moment. Last point is geography, actually. Like temperature is a very localized phenomenon. So the impact of temperature occurs in a given area, and then if you want to provide a country level shock or an aggregated shock, a regional level shock, you need to find a way to aggregate these local impacts. So this is what I do in 3 bullets. So first, I take daily county level average temperatures for the continental US between 1970, this is a typo, and 2019. And I use this daily temperature to construct quarterly shocks. I start by construct temperature surprises by county. So for each quarter T, so imagine to be in Q2 2022, so the quarter in which we are now. Imagine to be in the US and to be in the exactly that today is the 31st of March, so the last day before the QT starts. So actually you have in mind all temperatures that you experience in Q2 in the past years. So you have an expectations about the temperature that there will be in Q2 that is formed based on all temperatures, all daily temperature that you experienced in the past, in the very recent past. So on that distribution, I can compute the 10 and 90 percentiles that are used to identify the threshold for temperatures to be considered as extremely cold or hot in current quarter. So in other words, agents have in mind that in the days in which temperature go beyond some threshold, they experience unfavorable temperatures, both very cold or very hot. So now I start Q2. I come at the end of Q2. I count the number of days in Q2 with temperatures standing beyond those threshold. And then I can compute my surprise, that is the number of extreme days that is in excess of those implied by the reference distribution. So in other words, I expect to find 9 days of very hot temperature related to the season and 5 days of very cold temperatures related to the season. If these days are more than 18, actually there is a positive shock. If these days are less than 18, you find a negative shock. This is simply put. So after computing surprises by county, I aggregate county level surprises using the population that reside in those countries in the previous year. And this follows the literature, other papers in the literature like that of Colacito and co-authors. And using this weighting scheme, I can retrieve the quarterly US shock series. This is the my shocking formulas. And this is an example, just putting some numbers in the previous example. Imagine that the US is divided in just 2 areas, the West with 40% of population and the East. The numbers are fictitious. So regarding the West, I pull all days in Q2 in 2017, 2021. I compute the percentiles and I find that the 10 percentile is 40 degrees, the 90 percentile is 60 degrees Fahrenheit. I count I record the temperatures in Q2 and I find that the West had 8 days below 40 degrees and 15 above 60. So with this data, I can compute the surprise for the West in 2022 Q2. That is the difference, the excess days that I find in the left tail of the distribution and the excess days that I find in the right tail. These amount to 5 days for the West. If in the East, the surprise is just 2 days, I weigh these 2 numbers and I get 3.2 days, and this is the shock at the US level in 2022 Q2. Okay, so the insights of the shock. So as you see in my shock design, what matters is how much temperatures can surprise agents, and the idea is the following actually. The quarters, within the quarters, agents and firms and households can avoid temperatures in the short run if they are unavoidable. They can postpone tasks, postpone any kind of leisure, postpone any kind of activity that is not that cannot be made under the sun, basically. But actually, if these extreme days happen to be too persisting, actually they cannot be avoidable more within the quarter. So they materialize as a surprise, and this surprise should have an economic effect. The other point is that the shock designed in this way is season specific, so it's not extreme temperature per se that matters, but each quarter has its own extremes. So this is coherent with the idea that exceptional temperatures and not extreme temperatures is what matters. The other point, the third point that is crucial is that as beliefs are computed rolling, actually beliefs are updated every year. Actually, my shock nets out any adaptation measure that can be taken by agents before the quarters. So agents continuously learn from past temperatures. So what happens in the quarters is really a surprise on top of any type of adaptation agents are able to do also in the short run. As you see, my shock is two-sided, so this is a neutral assumption such that we value surprises on the left tail and right tail the same. And the underlying idea is that extremes are always bad. as you can see, this shock is based on the entire shape of the distribution, but is not a volatility shock. Actually, you can more I can more define as a kurtosis shock, because the thicker are the tails with respect to the past and the larger is the shock. So it doesn't map with a volatility shock. Okay, so let's go through the data. I take daily temperatures from the Northeast Regional Climate Center for the continental US from January 1st, 1970 to the end of 2019. And I take annual population and other variables that I use as robustness to weight county surprises from the Census Bureau. I end up with data for 3,053 counties that are highly representative for the US economy from any point of view, from the point of view of population, jobs, and personal income. Okay, so some descriptive statistics of temperatures at county level. This is a map of the growth rate of temperatures within my sample. As you can see, the climatic trends within the United States have been quite diverse. They have been strongest in the northeast part and in the west part, and milder in the center. And this is a picture of the surprises by county. So this is a time series of the variance of surprises. It's kind of a proxy of the severity of the shock on average through the sample under investigation. And what I find is that the shocks have been largest in the south of the country. In the south of the country and in the west, while they've been very small in the northeast. This is obviously, this is just a partial picture, because what matters is also the weights. So the population in the south part, the population is quite sparse, and population is more concentrated on the coasts. So the combination of these two pictures is what generate the country shock. This is the time series of the US temperature shock. I made the usual checks that you need to make in macro to define econometric shocks. The shock appears to be stationary, zero mean, and serially uncorrelated. And what catches the eye is that at the end of the sample, the magnitude of the shock seems to be a little bit smaller than at the beginning of the sample. So this evidence is interesting. It doesn't mean that we are experiencing a milder temperature that actually people living in the 70s experience, but it just says that the adjustment of the shape of the temperature distribution have been strongest and more abrupt at the beginning of the sample than at the end of the sample. Now, this is a focus on positive shocks only because one can wonder whether which is the tail that is driving shocks throughout the sample, and in which picture I report blue and orange bars, and blue bars are positive shock that are mainly related on surprisingly cold days, while orange bars are shocks mainly related to surprising hot days. So as you can see, blue and orange bars are almost equally frequent throughout the sample, and if anything, blue bars are slightly more frequent. So we don't find cluster within the sample, and we don't find an increase in the frequency of hot-related shock in the last part of the sample, and this kind of dispels some myth related to the fact that climate change is increasing the number of hot temperature shocks over time. In this picture, I can find four peaks of the shock that have been in 1977, 1989, 2000, 2003. I have a narrative for this shock, but if you're okay, I can go ahead and show you show you my application and the resulting effects on the US economy. All right, so what are the transmission channels of temperature shocks on the economy? The heat stress channel is something that I already explained in part before. Temperature can have health effects and also behavioral effects at work. They can generate work-related stress and also behavioral effect during leisure time. They can generate some biased perception of waiting time and another behavioral response. And all these things might reduce hours worked, the productivity, and also the quality of leisure. There is also the demand channel, such that is a channel related to the expenses due to cool workplaces and houses and to refresh production processes. There is also a third channel that I didn't mention before, that is the attention channel. There is a new literature that is more and more highlighting this new channel, that is the fact that extreme temperatures, like other climate-related phenomena, are able to raise the awareness on future climate-related risks, like a wake-up call effect. So agents experience this temperature, not only reacts to them, but also they react by anticipating future risks. So by making some ex-ante adaptation to future climate change. The econometric strategy is really simple. I make an impulse response analysis using linear local projections. The variable of interest are those that I mentioned before. The structure of control is quite strict. I include linear quadratic time trends and seasonal dummies. I compute my responses for 16 quarters after the shock with 68 and 90% bands. And main estimates are run within the overall sample that in 1975 to 2019. And this is the result, actually. So after a positive one standard deviation shock, basically all variables that I include in the estimates go down. As you can see, the effects are not significant on impact, and they build up over time, reaching a trough more or less after 2 years. If you inspect the impulse responses closely, you can see that the effect on investment at the trough is much stronger than the effect on consumption. It's 5 times the effect of consumption after 2 years. Regarding CPI, you can see the CPI falls too, but the effect is not significant. So on average, the response appears to be negative, but cannot be considered as significant, while on the contrary, the response of the short rate, that is the 3-month T-bill rate, and the one of the long rate are significantly negative. What does this mean? Actually, it means that if you consider that one standard deviation shock is more or less 4 days in a quarter, this means that for excess temperature days in a quarter, so a surprise of 4 days in a single quarter, lead after 2 years to a fall in real GDP by 0.3%, a fall in private consumption by 0.4%, and in real investment by 1.7%. And these results entail a fall in the 3-month rate by 25 basis points, and in the 10-year yield by 18 basis points. So these results seem to suggest that the monetary authority reacts to the effect of the shock by cutting interest rates. Actually, the next question is why so? So what are the channels that push the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates? In particular, these interest rates are the policy rate. The variation in the policy rates follow a measure made by the central bank to counteract the shock, or is just a way to support the detrimental effect on the economy without specifically targeting the climate shock. So actually the question that comes in my mind is whether temperature shocks are able to shape the view of the Federal Reserve on the economy for present and future quarters. So to have an idea on this question, I take economic forecast, the Green Book forecasts, that are economic forecasts made by the staff of the Federal Reserve, available to the FOMC prior to each meeting. I take the forecasts available that are from 1980 to 2015 for each meeting. I focus on forecasts on GDP and CPI, and I inspect the response to the shock on the current forecast, so the nowcast, and forecast at quarter T+1 and T+2. And this is the result. Actually, on the left column, I put the estimates on actual GDP and CPI in this subsample, and on the right, I put the response of the Fed nowcast on GDP and of the nowcast on the CPI index. And what you can see is that it seems that the Fed reacts by adjusting both GDP and CPI forecasts. Here on the first line, I have different scales on the y-axis, but more or less the result on actual GDP and GDP nowcast are virtually the same. This is not the same on the second line regarding CPI, because the Fed apparently overestimates the CPI effect at the beginning. In the short run, they estimate a positive response, while in the longer term, this response turns negative, while this effect appears to be almost not significant throughout the entire sample, using the actual CPI. This response that is positive at the beginning and negative in the longer term actually is in line with another work made at the ECB, in which the colleagues inspect the response of CPI in a large panel of countries, and they find for some countries that the effects on CPI change sign throughout the horizon of the response, becoming negative at the end of the sample. So this is the other question. So we saw that the Green Book forecasts react to the shock, but actually the next question is, does the Fed recognize climate and temperatures as a source of economic shock? For this purpose, I take FOMC meeting transcripts that are available since 1976. And for these transcripts, I define 3 sets of climate-related words to search within the transcripts. One set is a word that is specific, a set of words that are specifically related to climate change. And okay, so it's a typical climate change wording. The second set of words is related to temperatures, so and related phenomena like extreme heat, drought, heat wave, cold days, etc. And the first set of words is a set of words related to other climate-related disasters that are not directly linked to temperature. So I'm referring to flood, hurricanes, tornadoes, and so on and so forth. Here I'm plotting the occurrence of this wording over time. As you can see from the first picture, actually the FOMC mentions climate change explicitly very rarely. I find that the sum of the words mentioned during the meeting have been mentioned just 7 times since 1976. This is not the same for temperatures wording and natural disasters wording, for which the word mentions have been more frequent over time. So I use these two, the second and the third variable, as a response variable to see whether the attention by the FOMC members increase after shocks. And what I find is that temperature shocks stimulate more discussion regarding temperatures, and the effect appears to be on impact after the shock. And this is quite understandable. while on the effect is tiny because it's just 2 words, but it's not tiny related to the fact that on average temperatures are mentioned just 4 times per quarter. So in a relative terms, it can be considered quite a big effect. On the contrary, temperature shocks are not found to stimulate climate change debate more broadly, because I don't find the significant effects on other climate-related wording. All right, so I have in the paper a set of robustness estimates. Just to mention some of them, I disentangle the effect of the baseline shock into the separate effect of left and right tail shocks, and I find that the effects on GDP are similar. If anything, the effect of cold shocks are slightly stronger, and importantly, they are more significant on CPI. So I find a negative effect on CPI on average that is slightly significant in case of cold shocks. I also propose another breakdown that is heat versus cold shocks by season. And what I find is that the effect of the shocks is strongest in summer for heat and for cold, but cold shocks have also important effects in winter. Then I try other robustness exercises, for example, by changing the threshold beyond which I consider the days to be extreme. I use a stricter threshold and a wider threshold, and results do not change. I adopt different weighted schemes using employment by county, land extension, and personal income. I also try different learning periods. The 5 years is what I found in other papers in the literature, but I also try with longer time periods like 10 years. I try with other control variables, and the effects do not change particularly. So what I find is really a stable effect. I do not have time to go through each of them, but you can trust me. All these effects are in the appendix of the paper. Another exercise that I made is to relax the neutral assumption of a two-sided shock and propose a one-sided shock that is based on which tail can be more impactful in different quarters. I choose heat shock in summer and cold shock otherwise, and this choice is based on papers by Adum and co-authors, which try to estimate effects by season and industry, and mostly find this type of breakdown, and also results by Kolachit and co-authors are on the same line. And what I find is that the effect of the one-sided shock is quite similar to that of my shock, but slightly reduced inside. This means that actually a two-sided shock is what is needed to have a full understanding of the overall effects. Last, I propose another estimate that is a state-dependent local projection in which I investigate whether positive and negative shocks have different effects. And what I find is that only positive shocks that are detrimental to economic activity actually entail a significant response in macroeconomic variables, while negative shocks that are actually those that should ideally be beneficial for the economy do not produce particularly significant results. Okay, this is the end of the paper. Just to recap in 4 bullets, surprising temperatures at US level using my shock design matter as a true economic shock. They have a negative impact on the GDP, and this effect is a short-term effect that adds up to the level effect, to the trending effect in the long run of average temperature that is found in other papers in the literature. Regarding price effect, the results are less clear. I would say they're not significant on average, but they seem to be mostly tilted on the downside. In the appendix of the paper, I also repeat the estimate rolling on subsamples, and I find that this price effect sometimes appears to be significant, but this effect is quite discontinuous throughout the sample. So inspecting the price effects of the shocks in the United States is something that deserves other studies that can be considered as an avenue of future research. Regarding the reaction of the Fed, I find that the shocks lead to a reaction, and this reaction is made by conventional policy. The Fed cuts interest rate. This effect on interest rate is motivated by the fact that the Fed staff adjusts its economic expectations, and also during the meeting, the FOMC members reveal an increased attention to temperature variations after the shock. So this is the main results of the paper. I can stop here and so give the word to Anastasia to start the Q&A session. Thanks a lot for the attention.
Thank you very much, Filippo. This was a very interesting presentation. There are a couple of questions from the audience. The first one is from Laurent Ferrara, and it's how to explain that the maximum response on GDP is 8 quarters after a temperature shock. He thinks that the impact would be faster.
Mm-hmm. How do you want to proceed? I take all questions and then I answer, or
you tell me. Do you want to answer one by one, or I think there are 3 questions that I could read to you, and then you answer them all at once.
I can also reply to Laurent
okay.
now if you want. Okay, thank you very much, Laurent, for the question. Actually, this is what I expected at the beginning, to find an effect on the impact, but then I found a very interesting paper by Lemoyne in 2021, who find that actually this effect of climate attention is also important in regarding temperature and the macro effects. So the idea is that the effect of temperatures are not only contemporaneous, but are also lagged, because the agents have a reaction to what they see. They also have an ex-post adaptation to past temperatures, because they notice that something is happening, so they adjust their adaptation strategy to past temperatures, and then they also over time, and this phenomenon takes time. And also on top of this phenomenon, there is also this anticipation of future climatic events. So this ex-ante adaptation, this is something that builds up on this phenomenon. So there is a lag in the reaction, because there is a kind of a learning of agents after shocks. That is what generate a lagged response. This is my interpretation.
Okay. Next question is by Kevin Andrew. He says, I think that this is a really interesting shock that you have identified. Have you considered doing a forecast error variance decomposition to give an idea of how quantitatively important these shocks are for explaining fluctuations in GDP, consumption, investment, and interest rates?
Thank you for the question. No, I didn't try so far, but it's something that I think it's important to see. And from an econometric perspective, I know that it's not straightforward in the local projection framework, but for sure quantifying the contribution to fluctuation is something that should be done, and I'll take the suggestion. Thank you.
Next question by Pascal Will. Are the thresholds of what constitute temperature shocks adjusted by location? and over time?
Thresholds are adjusted. They are percentiles of the distribution, so actually they vary over time because this distribution is updated every year. So every year your belief regard the past 5 years. So then you pull together every year all the observation and recompute the threshold every year, but they are not adjusted at location level because they are somehow already adjusted at location level because surprises are computed in each county. So in each county, every year you updated your beliefs on the temperature you experience in that country. So I would say yes. So the threshold are time varying and location specific.
One more question from Daniele Colombo. He is wondering to what extent is it feasible, but it would be better to estimate the effects at the county level and then aggregate them to get the macro impact at the full US level. He says that if you first aggregate the surprises to get a shock at the full US level, he would be interested to check that if in a given quarter, the shock is mainly driven by the West territory, the response is also observed in the West territory and not the East territory. It would be quite puzzling if you were to find that after a surprise in the West, the response is mainly observed in the East.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. The problem is, yeah, I think it's interesting because, so if I understand your question, you'd like to understand, so what is the effect on US GDP is analyzed as a whole, but you'd like to see whether this effect comes from a falling GDP in some part of the country and not in other parts. I don't think actually the data are at GDP level are available at this frequency for such a long time span. Actually, I'm sure there is a quite new data set on county level GDP, but this data set it's a very recent one. It doesn't go very far away in the past. So I fear this empirically, this question is quite difficult to answer. One could try to make this thing in a short time period, but I'm not sure that is the same thing. Okay, thanks.
Okay, next question is by Chiara Colesanti. And it's, have you also tried to run the regressions on subsamples based on the periods, i.e. conventional versus unconventional monetary policy regimes?
Thank you. No, I didn't try. No, I didn't try this breakdown. Okay, yes, I can. Yeah, I can try it to see whether the reaction, the interest rate response can be different. This is the idea you have in mind. Yeah, okay, I'll take note, thanks.
One more question by Antonio Jose Garzon. Apologies if I killed the name. Regarding the effect on CPI, have you tried to estimate the response at a more disaggregated level?
No, this is a good point. This is a good point because, yeah. Okay, because there can be possible effects on core CPI and on the more volatile components. Yeah, I have to think about, but yeah, yeah. So the idea is that, as I understand your point, is that the fact that the effect is not easily detectable can be due to the fact that there is some variation in the effect of some component, while the effect on core CPI can be more stable. All right, okay, I'll try this, thank you.
One more, that's from Melise Moulou-Bailey. What do you think of the functional form of models that capture climate change and GDP or revenue as linear and interaction terms of temperature and rainfall as equally significant?
I'm not sure to understand the question. So, so you asked whether, okay, so if temperatures and so the effect of temperature can be different in periods in which precipitation are stronger or weaker. This is the question.
Maybe we can allow Melise to ask the question. Melise, would you like to answer the question or clarify to Filippo?
Yes. Yeah, can you listen me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Filippo, for your interesting presentation. I enjoyed it very much. When I come to my question, I mean, because it is apparent that temperature has negative impact as well as positive impact depending on the season as well as the agroecological zone of farm size or the country even. But when we regress, temperature itself with its linear form and with its square form, and when we interact is with rainfall as well, or are significant. But until now, I didn't get the real functional form of such models. You see, because we have linear term, we have squared term, and we have interaction term. But we just have non-linear. What do we mean? How non-linear is this non-linear models? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. I didn't try a non-linearity with respect to precipitation. I don't know. Yes, this is also a robustness that can be done, but I'm not sure to. I don't have an idea of why this can change the result and have an effect. So I'll think about more on this. Thank you for the suggestion.
I don't think there are any more questions, Filippo. So I would like to thank the audience for attending today. And just to remind you that our next webinar, which is going to be the final in the series, will be on July 11th. It should have been July 4th, but it's the 4th of July for the US, so it's vacation time. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you very much, Filippo, for a very interesting presentation.
Thank you very much, Anastasia, and thank you for the audience. Thanks to the audience for all the comments received, and I hope to see you soon in other webinars.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.